So, did I get a good battery? No, I didn't. No. I'm going to remind everybody that this Saturday is our monthly Bible study. And our Bible Q&A still, we're doing that. So that's Saturday at 10 a.m. And then Teresa's going to be hosting all of us for our 4th of July barbecue. Doug, I guess you're on the hook for the burgers. Is that right?
I am.
Yeah, I forget who we had for the dogs, but somebody signed up for that. Nancy. Okay, oh, back there. All right. So put your orders in with them now. But I want to remind everybody that'll be afterwards. We usually say 11:30 just to give us time between class and that. So
let everybody know we're only bringing 2 hamburgers. If anybody's got a good guess of how many I need to go get,
yeah,
that would be appreciated.
That actually would be a useful thing to know. I've got a whole bunch of bad batteries up here. I'll tell you that. All right, I'm connected. I'm live. You're probably going to say, you know what? It was better when we couldn't hear you, but that's quite all right. Good to see everybody tonight. We're finishing up tonight, Book of Judges. We're going to start next week with the Book of Joshua, and I put a bunch of class books up here. So after class, if you can come up, if you're like me, you won't remember, but if you can remember, come up and grab that. I also printed up some extra of our Galatians study. I couldn't remember if there was anybody who still needed some books or not. So new books, Book Joshua over here. Lamar, are you next? Which one of you is next week? So Ryan will be starting us off in Joshua next week. So Ryan, I do appreciate that. Before we get started in our class tonight, Michael, would you lead us in a word of prayer?
Dear Lord, we come before you now, gather here tonight to study your word. We ask that as we go about it, that we take your message and learn from it, apply it to our lives. Pray, Lord, that you be with those of our number who could not be here this evening due to illness and the ills that they may do so at the next point in time. We pray, Lord, also for those of our number, both near and far, that are traveling, and grant them safe journeys. Thank you for the blessings you've given us, especially your Son. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen. So if you were able to do the reading for tonight, I hope you were able to, and you got there into the book, there at the end of Book of Judges. This one was miserable. This was a very unpleasant study, something that is important for us to know, but certainly not enjoyable in the sense that oftentimes the stories that we can find in the Bible are. One commentator put it like this. I like, by the way, to use Kaufman for a couple of reasons. Number one, Kaufman is available on the internet, so I can just search him real quick on the internet. And he was a member of the church, so his commentary tends to be pretty good. But he took a quote here, and I thought it summed up this chapter well. Here we have the sewer of Scripture. That's a pretty tough language, but it really amounts to, it was a pretty terrible series of events here. The most disgusting story in the Bible, unredeemed by an admirable character or a noble act. To read these chapters is to be repelled by them, and one cannot help but feel rather dirty. It's I like this last part. It's almost as bad as reading today's newspaper. It was a while ago he wrote that too, so he'd have really been shocked to see our newspapers. So we got some bad things to look at tonight that are brought up. And I think I disagree a little bit to say there is no redeemable character. One of my favorite people in the Old Testament, one of my favorite more minor characters, we might say, in the Old Testament, Phinehas, the high priest, is going to come up in this. And I always like him. I always think he's a really interesting guy. But apart from that, yeah, this story doesn't go well. So we're going to go off and start ourselves in chapter 19. So if you want to turn over to Judges 19, a lot of stuff for us to look at. I don't know how much I want to read here other than I'll just go ahead and start us off with a few verses to get us going in chapter 19. It came to pass in those days when there was no king in Israel, that there was a certain Levite staying in the remote mountains of Ephraim. He took for himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah, but his concubine played the harlot against him and went away from him to her father's house at Bethlehem in Judah and was there for 4 whole months. Then her husband rose and went after her to speak kindly to her and bring her back, having his servant and a couple of donkeys with him. So she brought him into her father's house. And when the father of the young woman saw him, he was glad to me. The father-in-law, the young woman's father, detained him. He stayed 3 days, and they ate and drank and lodged there together. By the way, time-wise, I told you last week that this all seems to be very early on in the period of Israel's story of going into the land. Phinehas appears in the next couple of chapters, and Phinehas was one of the people alive in Joshua's time. In fact, he was alive in Moses' time. So that kind of gives you a sense of how early on these events are going on. And of course, it gives us the preface that we keep hitting, that in these days there's no king. Everybody just does what they want. They're just kind of doing what they want. So that kind of starts us off here with this guy. Question's going to be this. I thought I would just jump ahead of the question and throw it out there myself. What is a concubine? How would you answer that question when somebody asks, what is a concubine? What would you say that is? What do you think, Al?
It's part of the family, but a servant.
Okay.
Member of the
Okay.
family. They bore children.
Yeah. So who are some of the famous concubines in the Bible? Like, how about Hagar? For example, was a concubine. What else do you might describe about a concubine? Very good. Ben and Zilpah, the wives of Israel. Very good. They're both called concubines. Very good. Very good.
Well, they're kind of like a minor wife.
They're like
taken care of by the
yeah.
man.
They're like a low, a minor wife or an almost wife. I don't know how to describe it. It's interesting. So I read up, trying to find some great answer about this. And the best I could find is that a lot of the rabbis, and you got to be careful about how much I trust in them, but they would write commentaries about these things. And why I like them is they're old. I mean, you can go really far back, and so I feel like that the antiquity has some value. Is they said, well, maybe sometimes these constituted women that you really weren't supposed to marry. That, in other words, there were people you could say you couldn't have got a marriage license to marry. You might think of that today where, if two people, there's a legal impediment. Well, I guess in our country, sadly, there's nothing. But I mean, the idea that there might have been a legal impediment to getting married, they suggest that maybe that's sometimes what a concubine amounted to. Somebody who wasn't supposed to be getting married or that wasn't supposed to marry that kind of person, a concubine might be that way. The law of Moses gives no discussion of concubines, really. It doesn't mention them. It does talk about having more than one wife, but it doesn't talk about a concubine. Really, Genesis mentions them, and then in the book of Judges, we meet them again, and that's kind of it. And then we see the kings of Israel having them.
It's interesting that the scriptures say that they are husband and wife.
Very interesting that even like with Jacob, that the two women Bildad and I just forgot her name, Zophah, that they're called his wife, and I would suggest that that a concubine is just a wife, but it's a wife who really didn't win out on getting a husband, so to speak. It just it was her misfortune to not be called a wife. I just don't know how to describe it except to say it's certainly not derogatory, but it's certainly a bad thing. It's not a good thing. In other words, it's interesting. A lot of commentaries, or a lot of the ancient words for concubine just meant the same word as mistress, and so that to me again, it's not a gloriful thing to consider.
Wasn't there someone that had concubines and the son or someone took them and it embarrassed him?
Yeah. So David had concubines, and his son Absalom took them, and it was a great shame. Saul had concubines, and one of his sons accused his top general of trying to take his concubines. And then Solomon had a brother, and I just forgot his brother's name, that wanted one of David's concubines, and Solomon had him executed for it. So yeah, I mean, the idea was, they had a wife-like status, but they didn't have that same legal protection, you might say. And some people thought it was a way to get around the law of Moses and some of the requirements there. So again, just kind of an unusual thing. We'll come back to this second question in just a moment. So this man is delayed, and his father-in-law tells him, verses 6 on, hey, don't leave in the middle of the afternoon. Why don't you wait one more day, leave early in the morning? The guy says, nope, I'm getting out of here. I don't feel good about this guy for a lot of reasons, but let's start off with the fact that, his father-in-law is giving him good advice. You don't start a long trip in the afternoon. You need to start early, and, you can get further. And he says, no, I'm going to do what I want to do. They end up going by the city of Jebus, verse 10. Well, Jebus is also known as Jerusalem, but not yet. But it'll become Jerusalem. So verse 11, when they come near there, he says, the servant says, why don't we just stop there? He says, no, we'll go to our people. We'll go to Israelites. And so they come to the Benjamite city of Gibeah. So they come to Gibeah, and they go to lodge in Gibeah. And verse 15 says that they're going to lodge in the open square. He says he couldn't find anybody that would take him in that night. And about that time, one of the older men, an old man, comes from his work in the field. In verse 17, he sees them, and he says, where are you going? What are you doing here? And they tell him the story. And the old man says, verse 20, let all your needs be my responsibility, but don't spend the night in this square. Don't spend the night in this square. What first of all do we call this when somebody says, let all your needs be my responsibility? Hospitality. I want to pause for a second, and we're going to have to come back to this in a moment. Hospitality in an ancient time is a really big deal. It's a really big deal. And I would suggest to you that in Middle Eastern culture, it still is a really big deal. But the idea is that if somebody stays in your home, you're responsible for them. They're now the priority that you have, and you're taking care of them as a priority. You might remember how when Abraham saw the three men walking by, he runs out, he grabs them, and he says, we're going to kill a calf, and we're going to, get the bacon, and get all this food for you, and get to baking, not get the bacon. I get to clarify. Get to baking and make all this food, and we're going to take you in, see to your every need. Hospitality. Number 2, he says, don't you spend the night in this square. Because he was that hospitable? Probably not so much as what? He's afraid for him because this town is no good. So they come in. Verse 22 indicates that while they were there, certain men of the city, perverted men, surrounded the home. They said, bring this man out so that we can know him. This is an attempt to sexually assault this man. Verse 23, the master of the house says, no. Instead, what does he offer? His daughter. Where have you heard this story before? Lot. And where was this? Sodom and Gomorrah. You know what's interesting? Sodom and Gomorrah are the name for evil. In fact, the name Sodom becomes the name for homosexuality. But these aren't Canaanites. Who are they? These are children of Abraham. These are children of Israel. And it's fascinating that this story is such a profound parallel to what happened at Sodom and Gomorrah. So they cast out this man makes this offer. It says, verse 25, the men wouldn't heed. So the man, this is the Levite, I assume, not the older man, brings out his concubine and delivers her to them. And it's awful. I don't even want to go into it. Other than the next morning, she is dead on the doorstep. That's how awful they are. This is just, like I said, this is just an awful story. It's awful in every way. In some ways, to me, the worst part of this story, of a horrible story, is verse 28. Because what does he do? Well, before he cuts her up, he says, get on up here and let's get going. I cannot say how much contempt you can have for somebody that's their attitude after all of this. Come on up, let's get going, as though nothing has happened, and she's dead. So when he finds this out, he puts the body on his donkey. He never explicitly says she's dead, but the implication is she's dead, and he takes her, and then in verse 29, 30, he cuts her into pieces and sends the pieces out. This guy, I guess the question is this: why don't we have this guy's name? What do you think? No, it's a open answer. There's no specific answer. What do you think? I got an answer. I just wanted to see what you thought.
He acted so unlike a Levite.
Yes.
He didn't want to make the connection.
I think this guy is so contemptible, but pivotal to the story. But he's so contemptible. I think the point is, we don't even want to write his name. He is not, again, he's not the hero he's contemptible himself. He's pretty wretched himself. Even though, he's going to be the thing that kind of spurs this into action, I find him so contemptible that my feeling, you know what I say about feelings, they're not the thing to go by. But we don't have an answer. We don't know why. But I'm going to suggest, they didn't put this guy's name in here because he was really a pretty wretched fellow of himself. Go ahead, Josie.
Is this the part where he was a Levite but he wasn't a priest?
So, what an interesting question. It just says in verse 19, in chapter 19, verse 1, that he was a Levite. Josie, what do you think? I'll say this. I would say it's likely he's not. I would say, if I had to guess, based on just, average numbers, if only the descendants of Aaron are the priests, Aaron is just probably one of, 500 Levites. So I would probably say very few Levites were actually priests. I would say it's probably a very small percentage. Now, I don't know. That's just me guessing. But I also think that the way that the system of the Levites taking care of things worked is you probably just couldn't have a lot of priests. So my suspicion is that very few people were actually priests among the Levites. It was probably a very small percentage, right?
I was wondering, maybe Josie was thinking about, our last story in Judges where there was
That's true.
Another Levite sojourning. It seems like Levites sojourning around places isn't being very good for Israel.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, in fact, both of these stories are, and the Levite, who should have been the more responsible of people, was in fact, one of the culprits in each story. So, an interesting point. So Josie, to that end, that might also be the same question for the guy before too. So, Terry, what do you got?
Why 12 parts?
Well, why 12 parts? That's a good question. And the answer is 12 tribes, right? So he's going to send it out to the 12 tribes. Now, Here's a trick question. How many tribes are there? 13. Very good. You knew. So I don't know if that means he didn't send one to the Levites, because where would you send it? Or he's not sending one to Benjamin. But I get the impression that even among Benjamin, they were, that there was some sense of, you guys need to be a part of this too, although they're not going to. Instead, we're going to see in the next chapter, whenever he sends this out, and all the children of Israel from everywhere come together as one at Mizpah. And all the leaders and all the tribes are going to present themselves. But verse 3 says that the children of Benjamin heard about this. And understand this, they are not going to be a part of this. They're in fact going to, I'm going to jump ahead to read this real quick, that the children of Benjamin, down in verse 13, therefore deliver up the men, the perverted men who are in Gibeah, and we may put them to death and remove the evil from Israel. But the children of Benjamin would not listen to the voice of their brethren, the children of Israel. Instead, the children of Benjamin gathered together from the cities to Gibeah to go to battle against the children of Israel. So here we see this. The Israelites rise up and they say, man, we got to do something about this city. We've got to utterly wipe this out. This is awful. And like I said, to me, I'm thinking they probably invited Benjamin too. And Benjamin says, you're not gonna mess with our people. You ever see somebody kind of do something like that? They stand up to defend their family when their family did something terrible, but they say, no, I'm going to still defend my family because they're my family. It seems like maybe that's what's going on with Benjamin. You know, Benjamin's an interesting tribe. Because later on, what kind of things do we know about Benjamin? If you had to think further ahead. So there's some famous people from Benjamin. George?
They have mighty warriors.
They do have some really mighty warriors. There was one warrior that was a head and shoulders above all the rest, and he was well known for a great warrior. Who was that? Saul. King Saul. So they had a lot of mighty warriors. We read about one of the judges that was from Benjamin, the left-handed man. Kind of interesting, left-handed, it comes up here again too. Greg, what do you got? No, nothing? You had that look.
I'm just enjoying your lesson.
Oh, okay. Well, so here's the interesting thing about Benjamin. What do you got, Michael?
I find it interesting that when they're telling Benjamin, like, just deliver up the men, and it's like all of God's previous questions. It's like, no, we're indiscriminate. Everyone was going.
Yeah, that is interesting, isn't it? Yeah. Because it says it was just certain men, but I get the impression that maybe the whole town is in some way complicit for this. So very interesting, very interesting how that goes. There's something interesting about Benjamin. And I've always found this interesting because you remember the man Benjamin? He's the youngest. He's the, a little brother. You always get such a, sweet Benjamin. He's the, but whenever Jacob goes to bless his sons, this is what he says. Benjamin is a ravenous wolf. In the morning, he'll devour the prey, and at night, he'll drive the spoil. I always find that very interesting because, he wasn't talking about his son, Benjamin, but he was talking about who this tribe becomes. They become really vicious. So I see this blessing. I'm just going to answer my own question. What do you think of that? The blessing of Benjamin in Genesis 47. I see it as a foreshadow in general of the kind of people that Benjamin are. They're fighters. George said we've got some soldiers come from them. There's a guy later in the Bible that's from Benjamin, and he's a guy that's fighting Christians all the time. And that is Saul. Yeah, 2 Sauls. Interesting to think about the 2 Sauls from Benjamin. So the point is this, Benjamin, very interesting group of people. But we also know one other thing you might say to them. They're typically the smallest tribe. But we find out why tonight. That's the thing that's going to get us. Here's the thing that I think is interesting here. I just kind of thought, pause for a second and say, let's kind of bring up the application point. You see the idea of God, of Israel's constant decline. You say, why were the people of Gibeah like this? And my answer is, it seems like the last couple of classes have taught us that the Israelites are just so entrenched in the Canaanite way of living and Canaanite practices that it seems like they just can't escape this. So this is a lot like the idea of Israel in general and how bad they are. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 11 says they're an example for us. But we're supposed to think about this idea. And so the idea is, first of all, that in a lot of ways, this is just like Israel. This is just a microcosm of Israel's big problems. They just not only fail to live up to God's standards, but it seems like they look out for ways to do things worse. So point number one is this. This is really, as awful as this story is, this is Israel. This is Israel. You know, I've often thought, if I had a time machine and went back in time, what country would I want to live in? And I thought, you know, I used to think, well, I bet Israel would be a great place to live because those are God's people. They were very far from being godly people. Number two, as awful as this is, there's no question about it. Like I said, I have nothing but contempt for this. It still reminds us about the concept of how big a deal hospitality was. We saw it with Lot. And the Bible calls Lot righteous. So it's very interesting that Lot does something similar. You know, and again, it just plays to our mind that we can't wrap our mind around sometimes just how big a deal hospitality was. You know, we just can't appreciate how significant hospitality is. Why do I want you to think about hospitality?
We're supposed to be hospitable.
Because we're supposed to be hospitable, you know. I mentioned as we started class, Teresa's invited everybody. She's going to host everybody. Teresa, are you ready to die defending us if the heathen hordes show up? Well, you know, hospitality's changed, but let's just appreciate hospitality's a big deal. Us inviting each other over and doing things with each other and accepting hospitality, sometimes it's as hard to accept it as it is to offer it. Those are big deals. Those are big deals. Those are things that are significant. Stephen?
I was thinking about the Pharisees inviting Jesus.
Yeah. You know what's interesting? How many times Jesus accepted.
Yeah. And,
you know, it's interesting because Jesus will eat with them, and the Bible will say, and he could discern their hearts. Could you think of anything that would ruin your meal more than sitting with people that were just wretched and you knew what they were thinking all the time and such, and yet Jesus always accepted? And I think there's a point to say, there's a lot of times we don't accept hospitality. We say, I got other things to do. We should. You know, I tell you what, your brothers or sisters invite you over to their home, never say no. You know, I'll lay that on you. Never say no. Your brothers or sisters say, hey, everybody, we want you to come over. Never say no. I mean, obviously, you can't go, but it's your choice. Always accept. Because Jesus always accepted, even when the people that invited him were the worst. So think about that for a moment. Hospitality is a big deal. Let's go ahead and go on as we're talking here in the next chapter. I'd already started us off by saying they call everybody together. They draw their men together. They get this force together. And their first answer, and Michael kind of pointed this out, the men of Israel, verse 11, it says, gathered against the city, united together as one man. And their first point is to say, we're going to destroy all of this. We're going to wipe this out. But the children of Benjamin, we already read verse 14, refused to let this happen. Now remember, they've drawn down their forces. They said, do you remember the percentage of men that they had? All the men assembled, and they said, let's just take this percentage. 10%. We're just going to take out 1 out of every 10 men. And we're going to bring those men in. So 1 out of every 10 men instead of all of our men. Because this should be simple. All of us against one little town. But then all of Benjamin, the whole tribe of Benjamin responds. And verse 15 says it's 26,000 men who plus the 700 in the city. So 26,000 men now show up. This is no longer a little, can we call it a police action? That would be a good description. This is now an actual civil war that's getting started here. So the children of Israel, and by the way, to me, one of the most significant things in this story is about to happen, the thing that I dwell on the most. Children of Israel do what they're supposed to do, and they ask God, what do we do? And God says, or who should go first? And so the Lord says, Judah first. And if you read it, Judah goes off and wins the day? No. What happens? God said Judah goes first, and Judah got whipped. This actually, to me, the next few verses are one of the more remarkable stories. Verse 23, the children of Israel weep before God. They go back to God. They say, God, what do you want us to do? Shall we draw near for another battle? Should we go fight Benjamin? First time they asked, who goes first? Now they're saying, well, should we even be doing this? And so the Lord said, yes, go get them. So this time, they asked the right question, right? And they went out and they got beat again. All right, this story is really something. They get beat again. Verse 26, all the children come out. It says they all, by the way, this is the first time the word fasted pops up in the Old Testament, used the way we used it last Sunday. And they all fast that day until evening. They offer offerings to God. They go to God. And whether or not they had gone to God this way or not, it's not clear. But now they're going to the ark. And Phinehas, it tells us, we see Phinehas here. Shall we go again? The Lord says, go tomorrow, because tomorrow I'll deliver him to you. And so they go out, and what happens the third time? They win, yeah. So they defeat them, and the Benjamins are wiped out. Sake of time, we can't read the battle. It's kind of interesting the way the battle plays forward, but ultimately what you need to know is that the children of Benjamin are wiped out. And thousands of them. In fact, in verse 46, it says, those who fell that day were 25,000 men. Remind me how many men in verse 15 came out to battle? 26,000 men went into battle. How many came out? 1,000. That is catastrophic. This battle, this war, has gone catastrophically for Benjamin. Now, we'll come back to this in a moment. Let's camp on the thing that I think is the most interesting thing here. What happened? Why is it that Israel went to God and God said, send them, and it failed? They went to God, God said, go again, they failed. And the third time they came back. What do you think is going on here? What do you think happened? I think this is actually a super important thing for us to think about. Go ahead.
God loves obedience.
Yeah.
There were no obedient people. I wouldn't say that. There was a lacking of obedience on both sides.
Okay.
And God is punishing Judah for they haven't been keeping the law.
All right.
They haven't been asking God, what should we do?
All right.
And so they lost.
So right off the top, what I think is interesting about what George is saying, and I think there's maybe more than one answer here. So again, we're having to put together conclusions based on what the information we're given. So number one, George says, well, it's not like these people have been very righteous. Here's something I think is a big deal. I think of one of my favorite stories in the New Testament are the 7 sons of Sceva. You guys remember that story? Sceva was a priest. His 7 sons said, hey, we've been watching those Christians. They're not Christians. And they say, I think we can do what they did. So they ran in to battle a demon. And you guys remember what happened? They said, demon, we command you to go out in the name of this Jesus that Paul preaches. Boy, that's about the most uncommitted casting out. And what happened?
Demons jumped all over.
The demons ripped them to pieces. I shouldn't laugh, but it is to me very laughable the way the story goes, that they all run out, screaming and yelling. And it's kind of a, if you're not on God's side when you're asking God for help, you really shouldn't expect God to help you, George.
The demons asked or said, Jesus I know, or we know.
We know Paul. Yeah. I love that. I love that statement. And you had to know you're in trouble at that point, right? So point number one, George makes, or the first way to look at this is this. George makes a good comment to say, Israelites have not been very faithful. This is in that period in Judges 1 and 2 where it says they weren't carrying out after Joshua. They weren't doing the things they were supposed to be doing. So yeah, we get a good sense of what's going on here. But it's a great thing for us to think about the thing, to say, I talk to people all the time and say, I prayed to God for this problem to go away and nothing happened. And I said, well, what kind of relationship do you have with God? Well, I didn't do anything with God. God's not a genie lamp. We don't say, hey, I'm gonna make my wishes and God's gonna grant them. The reason God listens to us is because we have a relationship with him, not because we're just throwing pennies in a pond and making a wish. And yet I think in the world, I know that's what most people are doing. I think it could be that sometimes we even think that way, where I don't take God too serious, but then with the moment I need him, I'll take him serious in that moment. And that's not kind of friendship and relationship God is looking for. So number one, George says, well, it could be because of their unrighteousness. I think that's a great thing to consider. Teresa and then Becky.
Well, we always expect God to answer us in the positive, and that isn't always the case.
All right.
Sometimes it's the negative.
I want to pause there because I want us to hold on to that idea because I'm going to make that number two. You might have meant it as number two. That this is the idea of another good thing for us to think about in that sense. So I'm going to come back to that, Teresa. Becky?
I just wanted to point out that maybe you already made this point, but God didn't promise them a win on either of the
That's
first
right.
two.
That is right, isn't it?
It's not until the third one that he says, go up and I will deliver them into your hand.
What I think is interesting is, number one, they say, hey, who goes first? And, we'll send Judah. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. There isn't a promise of victory.
Right.
And I have to think that the second time they think, well, let's be a little more specific with our question. Maybe we asked this wrong. And again, you're right. God didn't say victory. He said, go on up and attack. And then he says, tomorrow I'll give you the victory. That is very interesting, Becky. And again, I think that's critical to say God didn't say you're going to win. Now, I actually want to add that to what Teresa said just a second ago, because I think that's really important. God didn't say you're going to win right away. Go ahead.
We have to look at what the people did before that third battle.
Yeah, that they went. Well, and again, it's interesting because they fasted, they mourned.
They
Built an altar, made sacrifices, yeah. And I think, again, I think this speaks to the idea that maybe they were starting to say, maybe we've not been, maybe we've not been doing what we need to be doing, Grant.
I was going to say along the same lines, it seems like with each question, they kind of get closer to maybe how they were supposed to be doing it. Because the second time, the first time they just say, who goes up first? And the second time they say, should we be doing this?
Yeah.
I think it should have been the first question.
Yeah.
The third time they're offering sacrifices and fasting.
So I think there's something really important for us to think about. How do we approach God? Number one. Number two, let's go ahead and move forward to what Teresa said. Teresa said, well, wait a second. Maybe it isn't even that they had done something wrong. I did think they did something wrong. But I think there's a bigger lesson for us here. And that is, God doesn't always say, you know what, I'm going to make everything as easy as it can be for you so that every time you do something, it just happens, works out right away. I think we can all appreciate that, but maybe we sometimes say, you know what, you try to do the right thing and everything goes wrong. That's a common story for all of us. And I think that there's something critical to consider that whenever we're trying to do things that are God's will, and I got to be careful to say, I do think, going back to what Michael said earlier, I do think this is all God's will. I mean, they could not allow these people to get away with this. But I think the problem is they weren't really in tune with God's will. They kind of abstractly knew it. But I think even if they had known it and it didn't work out for them, they needed to appreciate that sometimes you have to just keep doing it. You keep at what you're supposed to be doing. We're going to face a lot of times where you talk to your neighbor and your neighbor throws it back at you. What do? You quit. You go home. You never talk to them again, right? I hope not. But that's the instinct. I tried to do the right thing. It didn't go so well. I'm done. But maybe it's just the kind of thing that we have to keep trying. We have to keep working at it. And that's a big deal to me that comes out of this, that it's easy to get discouraged when you said, I did the right thing and it didn't work out. You know what? That's not unusual. You got to keep going.
Makes me think of Paul. Paul, he went through. He didn't give up. Never gave up.
Yeah. And you think of the things that he wanted to accomplish, and they got knocked out of him. There's a lot more we could say about that, but it really is interesting to think of that. Grant and then George. George.
He gets stoned, and then he gets up and goes back in.
And then he goes back in. Yeah, I think of Paul going to Ephesus, and there's 50,000 people screaming and yelling, and he says, "Oh, good, a crowd! I can't wait to talk to him." And his friends are saying, "Paul, read the room. This is not your moment." So it's really something. Do you want to add something?
I was going to say kind of different from what we were talking about. I think it's interesting because it talks about Phinehas is the one who is here ministering, and it seems like he's the one offering the sacrifices.
Yeah.
And it looks like at the end of Joshua, it says that Gibeah is Phinehas' town. That it calls it the town of Phinehas.
I never. But Oh, that's very interesting. That is not something I ever noted before. Well done. You stumped the chump. I congratulate you.
I don't know if that's significant.
I don't know what that might mean. That could have something more to speak of the idea that maybe after it's destroyed, that Phinehas becomes the. I'm profoundly interested in looking into that. I wished I'd seen that.
One other application for us is sometimes when things happen to us, like look at Job, it has nothing to do with us. It could have something that's going to be a positive effect for someone else, but it really doesn't have anything to do with us.
Boy, Teresa, that is a 1 hour's worth of trying to kind of think about what Teresa just said. Teresa said, sometimes it really doesn't have anything to do with us. Now, Teresa, you also said Job is a good example of that. Because who suffered everything that Job suffered? His wife. But it wasn't her story. Now, what I mean by that is not to diminish her. She suffered terribly, but it was actually pertaining to something else. Now, that's very interesting, Teresa, that we don't always appreciate the idea that whatever's going on might not be about us. Sometimes Mrs. Haynes will say, Brian, not everything's about you. I don't appreciate that. But I recognize the wisdom of the fact that she'll say, you talk about, something happened today, and I say, Wendy, they just, nobody's listening. It's not all about you, Brian. May have had nothing to do with you. And that's an interesting point. We're going to run out of time if we don't move to this last chapter. Although I'd rather talk about this. We're going to move on because we want to have some sense of completion, and I'm not going to give you a very good one. This is a kind of a ridiculous thing that's about to happen. So they look around and they realize, we just wiped out most of the tribe of Benjamin. And boy, do we feel bad about that, I don't know what to tell you as far as, what brings about this, the attitude of why it is that verse 3, O God of Israel, why has it come to pass in Israel that today there should be one tribe missing? They're all lamenting this. Do we have a good sense of national unity? Are we just, is it over dramatic? I don't know what to say other than they're saying this is really terrible. But here's the problem. The problem is they made an oath that everybody has to come deal with this, which I can understand. And nobody is to do what? You remember what the oath was?
No one's to give his daughter to a Benjamin.
No one is to allow their daughters to marry people from Benjamin, the people of Benjamin. So the children of Israel grieve for Benjamin, their brother. Verse 7, what do we do for wives for those that remain? Since we swore they can't have any wives. This is absurd. So first of all, they say, who did not participate in the war? And they say, well, Jabesh Gilead. They say, well, we did swear that, we won't allow them to live. So this army of Israel attacks this city and kills the people and takes all the unmarried women and delivers them to Benjamin and says, okay, I think they say in verse 12, 400 women. And so they pass those on, but the problem is verse 14 ends in saying, but that's not enough. That's not enough. So they come up with this absurd idea. Well, we said we can't give them our daughters. But I don't know, is this 7 brides for 7 brothers? But what if they stole them from us? And we said, let's not make a problem. So they say, and by the way, this is kind of a strange thing that they say. Verse 19, there is a yearly feast of the Lord in Shiloh. Pause for a moment. We just read in the last chapter, Shiloh's where the tabernacle's at. What yearly feast are we talking about? It's got to be the Passover. So I always find it interesting they say that. And so, why don't we do this? Let's just tell those remaining Benjaminites, why don't you guys lay out and, we'll send, when the daughters of Shiloh come out or these women come out, you take them and we'll say, well, why don't you just, we won't fight over this. You'll take them. It's an absurd story. Somebody's going to ask me, how did the logistics of this work out? I don't know, except to say this is their way of settling this problem. Now, it's not really going to settle the problem because Benjamin's always going to be a small tribe after this. This will mark them from now on. But ultimately, these absurdities are kind of capped off with this last statement in verse 25. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And I can't help but to think, and by the way, the book of Judges kind of ends during the period where we're starting to get ready to have a king, that a lot of people might have said, boy, I really do think we should have a king. I can really understand what the logic of that is. I'll tell you what, we're nearly at our time. Let me just kind of jump ahead and just kind of hit the couple of application points. Application point number one. There's a great point here about with an absence of leadership, you just run into so many problems. And that's been the last couple of chapters, I think. Not just this class, but the last class as well. And we kind of get a good sense of what it is with Israel in general. And the fact that they just, without good leadership, they were just constantly in trouble. This is the book of Judges. The book of Judges is, rather than having continual leadership, that when they do have leadership, it's good. But when they don't, things fall apart. What's the application that I want you to think about today? It's obvious. Leadership in the church. And I'm careful to say, of course, I mean elders and deacons and preachers and teachers. But I also mean Titus 2, older men and older women, fulfilling those roles in teaching things there. When churches don't say we should always be working on leadership, let's say we had 20 elders this week and 20 deacons, and we say, we don't have to worry about it anymore. What happens in 10 years? You don't have 20 elders and deacons. We should be prioritizing leadership constantly. We should be prioritizing or focusing or discussing or teaching. We should be pulling aside every young person there is and saying, hey, one day we're going to need you to lead this place. You're going to have to be the one to take care of these things. And I wonder if these were the kind of conversations that were lacking in Israel, that nobody was saying, hey, when I'm gone, you're going to need to step up and take care of things. It's tough. But everybody here needs to appreciate that leadership isn't just a couple of people's job. It's everybody's job. Maybe we're not the leader, but it's our job to be pushing for leadership constantly. That's a big deal. That's a big deal in Israel. And I have to say that whoever wrote Judges, I told you probably Samuel, Grant said, he gave me some good reasons why he thinks it's not Samuel. Whoever it was really saw all of Israel's problems kind of summed up in that last verse, that there just wasn't somebody. There just weren't leaders that were stepping up. And I find that fascinating because I think there's a lot of problems in Israel. But what if leadership really is the big thing? We're at our time. Next week, you go back to one of the greatest leaders in the Bible. A lot better stories coming out of the book of Joshua. A lot better things to be encouraged by. So look forward to your time in going to that. Thanks for all the good comments and thoughts we had tonight.